Hi, my name is Ram, and welcome to the second episode of the series where we develop real-world web application with React and Node.js and the whole JavaScript stack. So in this session today, what I'm gonna do, what I want to achieve, is to make a synchronous request to the server and to set up server for that, and then respond with error message and display this error message in our login form. And in the next session, we're gonna wrap up this login functionality by implementing the JSON Web Token authentication itself. But before we begin, I have a small announcement. Some of you asked me how you can support me and my work, and now I listened and I created Patreon page. So as you can see here, it's a beautiful one, and I have 0 patrons right now, so you have a chance to be the first one. So if you want to support me and you have the spare buck, please go to this page and make your donation. Also, I want to create a very small but dedicated and focused community of people who really motivated to learn JavaScript, to learn web development, to talk about it on the forums. So when you donate, you get access and invite to my own private community where you can ask your questions regarding my courses, regarding my screencasts, articles, propose your ideas for future episodes, etc. This community will be my priority when I communicate and answer questions, because I really hate YouTube comment system. It's just it's irritating. So if you want to support, follow the link in the description below. And yeah, now this is out of the way, let's get down to the development. So now right here we have the login page, and what we want to do when we log in, when we submit data, we want to make a synchronous request to the server. And to do that in Redux, we use Redux thunk actions, and for that we need to set up all Redux stuff. So let's go to terminal and let's yarn add Redux, React Redux to connect React and Redux, and Redux thunk for asynchronous and actions with side effects. So now in editor, let's go to index.js file, and I'm going to do it right here in this file. Later, maybe we will extract it into a separate one, but for now, we are safe to do it right here. So first, I'm gonna import create store function and apply middleware function from Redux. So create store creates Redux store, and the store is the most important stuff, right? That's why we actually use Redux. And apply middleware allows us to use thunk middleware. Also, we'll need provider higher order component from React Redux to connect Redux and React. And we need to have thunk from Redux thunk like this. Okay, so let's create store. So I define constant store. That's the result of the function create store, and this function takes 2 arguments. The first one is the root reducer, and the root reducer will be the whole tree, right? The whole state object that will be used via combined reducers. And the second one is apply middleware, and we apply middleware thunk like this. Another thing that I really want to install is Redux DevTools, and we're gonna install and set them up in a minute. But first, root reducer. So let's import root reducer from root reducer, and let's create a root reducer.js file. So here we will use combine reducers from Redux. That's the help us function that helps us to combine different reducers. So this way we can have multitude reducers and just combine them into one. So we export default result of this combine reducers function that takes the object. And let's add user as the first entity that we're gonna have in our Redux store. So user is just the current user information. We're gonna store maybe email here and authentication token, JSON web token. So, but for now, we'll just create empty dummy reducer, and reducer is just the function that takes state and returns new state. So like this, and we have a function that returns an empty object. Okay, so now let's install Redux DevTools. I opened here DevTools page and scroll down to the third way to install them. So all you need to do is install this extension. Also, you need to install a Chrome extension or Firefox extension for your browser. yarn add dev. I can't type today for some reason. And now, next, what I need to do is to use compose with DevTools wrapper around apply middleware. So I'm going to just copy this line. And let's go to index and let's import it. And we're going to wrap our apply middleware into compose with DevTools. Also, what we want to do is to use this provider. So the provider itself is a high order component, so that we inside of which we want to wrap our application. Okay, so like this, provider, and provider takes store prop that we just defined, store. So now the store and Redux itself is available to our React application. Redux DevTools extension, okay, doesn't like that I use it like in dev. Oh, okay. Okay, let's place it again. Maybe I'll change this rule later. Let's move it to here. So now we have, hopefully, we have Redux installed. So let's go to browser. And here, everything seems to work fine. We go to Redux tab here and go to state, and you can see that we have state user empty object. So we have no errors and we have Redux store available to us. Nice. So let's commit this change. We call it Redux setup. Okay, so now we have Redux. So that means that we can have actions and dispatch them. So let's start from the end point, so from the user UI. So in login page right here, we have this submit function which now consoles log data. But what we want to do, we want to take this data and pass it and dispatch thunk action with this data. So here how it can look. Right? So in this props, we'll have login thunk action. We pass data to it, and it will return promise. And if everything's okay, then we want to redirect to homepage. So on my mocks, it's to dashboard, but for now, let's redirect to homepage. And to redirect, so we have then, and to redirect, we'll use the history. And history is passed to this component by React router, because this is the page component, right? It is the component, the route component. So we have this props history.push main page, like this. Okay, so history is provided by router, and login will be available to us when we connect this component to Redux. So let's define this prop types. Prop types define, and we have the history. Let's start with history. That's gonna be shape. I forgot to add shape snippet here, so I'll do it manually. And inside of it, we'll have push function. Okay, so we have history object, and what we do not need to define the whole history object with all things that in there. We just need to define in prop types what our component needs, what it expects, and it expects history object with push method on it. And the second one is login, which is function. And we need to import prop types. So now we need to connect this component to Redux, and for that we use connect function from to double N here. connect function from React Redux. And at the bottom here, we connect our login page. So the first parameter is map state to props. That allows us to pass some data from Redux state into this component. We do not need anything in this form, so we just pass null. And the second one is map dispatch to props. So this is where we can wrap our functions in dispatch, and that's why we simply can just call them. But we not just call functions, we call the dispatch this action. So for that, we can use very simple and nice shortcut. Just provide object with the functions that we want to wrap in dispatch call. So we'll have login here. And let's import login from actions, can type login. Auth, let's call it auth. So we're gonna store all our actions in one folder, all our reducers in another folder. So let's create actions auth.js file, and here we define our thunk action. So thunk action is just a function that returns another function. So we'll define, let's export constant login, and it equals function that takes credentials, and it returns another function, and inside of it we'll make the API request, and all our requests will store in one API object that will have all our requests. This application is not huge, so we do not need to actually split it down to separate objects to create a lot of files. It's just going to be one file with one object, and they're very basic. The request to our API is very simple, so we don't need something more elaborate. Okay, so here we'll have some kind of API object, user login, that we're going to create in a moment. We pass credentials into it. It will return promise, and we'll take the promise and the data that was returned from the server, and we get response data user from it. So that's what we actually expect. And this is the template that we're going to use throughout this application, throughout almost all API requests. So we will have API request that will return promise, and then we get the data from this request, and we pass it along to the next action. This thing here, we can do it here, but I prefer to do it in API. So this way, I do not need to do this, but I just have user data from the server right away. And after that, I dispatch regular, pure action, Redux action. So dispatch, and I call it user logged in, and pass user into it. Okay. So this is the most thing that we're gonna do with thunk actions. That's what most of my thunk action looks like. So I make API request, then I get data, and I dispatch Redux action that will change via reducers the Redux store. Also, we're gonna use normalizer later to normalize this data. But for now, just to keep it a little bit more simpler, we'll use it like this. Excuse me. So here is my convention. That's just the naming convention that I use. I use the past tense for my Redux actions. So user logged in. Another way to do that and naming that is, for example, user login success. But that makes sense that when you have user login failure, if you store your process, this process of failure and maybe loading, syncing, etc. in Redux, then it makes sense. But we're not going to do that. We'll handle all this locally in the components. So now we need to define this. So we export constant user login. it takes user and it returns object with type user logged in, and we pass user down to it. So now we need to define this constant. We're gonna import it from, so user logged in, import from types. And we need to import API, let's say from API. So now we need to create these two files. So let's start from types. So types.js, and we we export const user logged in equals user logged in, like this. And then also we need to create our API. So let's create api.js, export default object. Here we'll have user, and inside we have login. So this login function will take credentials, and then we'll use access to make post request to it. So we'll have access post API auth, we pass credentials to it, and then when we have the response, and if everything's okay, no exceptions, we'll have the response from server, and we get response data user object from there. Okay, so now we need to import access, and let's also yarn add access to our project. I actually adore access. It's an excellent library. So you can use fetch or any other kind of library that makes it your life easier, but access is perfect. Give it a try. Okay, so now we have API. So let's recap what's going on, right? So in login page, we have the submit. So when we click on submit in our login form, this function is called, and we dispatch login function, login action with passing data form, so passing the credentials into it. So here in auth, here it is, we make an API request with these credentials right here with access. Then we take the response from the server and we get data user object from it. We're gonna have email and token in there. And then we dispatch normal Redux action with this user data. Now we need to create reducer that will handle this particular action. So when this action is dispatched, we want to place this user data into our state. So let's do this. Let's go to root reducer, and instead of this dummy function, we're gonna remove it. And I'm gonna just import user from reducers user. Let's create reducers user.js, and I create reducer. So reducer is just a function that takes states and action and returns new state. So here's the boilerplate. We have the state that is an empty object, action is an empty object, and then we switch by action type. And by default, we just return the same state. So, but now we want to handle this case with user logged in. And what we want to do, we want to return new state for this particular piece of state. And this piece of state is action user. So let's import user logged in from types. Okay, so if you're familiar with Redux, it should be very simple for you. If you're not, again, that's not that educational course, it's not a course, so just bear with me, try to understand it, and if you do not, maybe look for educational material on Redux or my previous screencasts about it. Next, so let's test it out. So let's commit, no errors so far. Let's log in, and here network, we have auth requests. We make an auth request. We cannot post because there's no server yet, and we pass in credentials. Excellent, it works. Right? So now we need to create our Node backend server application, and we'll build it with Express framework, and we'll start with empty folder as well. So I'm gonna open a new tab here, cd back into it. So here I have my React app, and let's make their bookworm API and cd into this API. So here, let's yarn init. And let's open it in Sublime Text. We're ready to rock. So first of all, let's in source folder recreate index.js file. So this is going to be our main entry point for our server. And here I will just create now Express app, but I want to use all the goodies of ES6 and ES7 like I do with my React app. So, but I can do it right now with Node.js. So for example, what I want to write, I want to import Express from Express. And then I want to define constant application to be invocation of Express. Then I want to define route. So for example, it's going to be the route, the catch-all route, request response. And I want to respond with send file. And I want to get the name index.html. So I just want to render index.html that is in this particular folder. So I need to import path from path as well. Path is just the module, node module. Okay, so that's what I want to do. And then I want to listen on port 8080, for example, and console.log running on local host 8080. Done. So that's what I want to have. Let's go to package.json file, and here let's add scripts start, and we run it with node source index.js. Let's try it out. Yarn start. Bam, we can do that because Node doesn't know, it can't handle imports. It uses the required JS or something like that, common JS pattern. But we want to do this. Babel to the rescue, or babel. I don't know how to pronounce it, really, like GIF and GIF. I actually pronounce GIF and Babel, so yeah. So let's install it. For that, we need to add in dev Babel CLI. Babel CLI will provide us with Babel node that will run that we will run instead of simple node, and we need to have Babel preset env, and this preset env will allow us to use any kind of ES6 and ES7 goodies in our code. So instead of using separate presets, you just make it automatically, which is awesome. So here I need to create a Babel RC file and make sure that I have presets, and inside of it I use env preset, and this preset actually we can configure it further, but it's good for now. Okay. So now if we go back to package.json, instead of Babel, instead of node, we just use Babel node. Let's try it out. Yarn start. Bam. And it actually works, because now you can see that we do not have Express, so it runs the code. Let's yarn add Express, and let's try it again. And we run in a localhost 8080. I do not trust computers, so let's check it out. 8080. Okay, it runs, but we do not have index.html. So let's go back to editor and let's create in source, we'll create index.html file. HTML5, we call it bookworm API. And that's just a dummy page that we're not going to use it. It will be replaced by React index.html page. But for now, just for our API can work separately, we provide it. But let's provide some helpful message. So this is API, not a website. Learn your What can routes. Be better than the witty remark by the man who thinks that he knows how to make jokes, right? Okay, so if you go to our browser, it works. And nice, right? Another thing is, if we make any changes, we need to restart our server manually, but that's a pain. So let's use yarn add dev Nodemon, and Nodemon just will restart server every time we change files in our project. So it's installed, we go to editor, we go to package, and here instead of babel node, simple babel node, we use Nodemon, and we execute babel node, and then pass the index file as the starting point to Nodemon. So now if we go back and run yarn start, we run it from the Nodemon. Nice. So now we have server. And we making request to auth route. So let's create, right now just in index.js, later we will split it into separate files, our routes. Here we'll define another route. Post request to API auth. There's going to be request, response, and here we just respond with status, let's say 400, with JSON and errors object. And this errors object will have the global key, and we have invalid credentials, like this. So we created auth route, and it always responds with error object and the status 400. So this status is not okay, so that will raise an error, throw an error in our React code. And this code, this error we want to catch and display this particular error from the server to the user. So let's have a look in our React application. So if we submit the form, now we have the same not found error message. Why is that? Well, because React just now makes the request to localhost 3000, but our API is on another port, 8080. So we need to create a proxy. And with create React app, it's very simple. So let's go to code. Let's open package.json file. And here at the bottom, we'll define proxy. And this proxy will point to HTTP localhost 8080. Now in terminal, let's restart our application. Okay, application is restarted. So I'm gonna just provide some password, login, and now we have 400. So we're making request to the server, and it responds with global error, invalid credentials. So the next thing is to display this error to the user. So for that, we go to, so where it happens, right? So in login page, we handle the happy path. So if everything goes well, if no rejection, no errors are thrown, then we redirect to homepage. But if something goes wrong, then we catch this error in login form itself. We can catch it anywhere. We can catch it earlier, but that's quite convenient. So here in our on submit, right here, we have this submit, it returns promise, because here we return the result of this login, and this is the promise. So here we can catch error. So we have catch, error, and here we just set state for errors to equal error response data errors. Okay, and that's it. So now when something goes wrong, errors, validation errors from the server will be written to this state, to the Redux, to this component state, and we can display them, for example, with message. Let's import message from semantic UI, and here we'll have if errors global exists. So if there are global errors, we'll create message negative, and inside of this message we'll have message header. Something went wrong. How cool this message is, right? Something went wrong. Very useful. And here we'll just display this errors global message. Done. So now if we try to log in, something went wrong, invalid credentials. So this is the error from server side. So the same way we can validate fields here, check for uniqueness, or do all the validations that we do on client, we should do on server. We must do, not should, we must do on server as well, because it doesn't matter what we do on client, server should be the most secure part of our application. So all of this stuff we will do later, and we will validate it on server. And so we can respond with errors, and they will be rendered as they rendered for the client-side validation errors. Nice. So another thing that I want to add is loading state. So right now we have loading in our state, but we do not use it. And Semantic UI has this loading state for forms, which is pretty cool. So here we have loading false. So now when we on submit, when everything's okay, we're making this request, but before we do this request, before we invoke this submit function, we can set state loading to true. And then here in catch, if we have error, we set it to false, back to false. When everything goes well, we just redirect, so this component will unmount, so we do not need to do anything else. Now we can use this loading, and right on form here, I'll just get loading equals to loading, and I'm gonna fetch it from state loading. Let's have a look. So now when I click, it's too fast, but you can see like it has this loading spinner there on the form. We can make it slower, for example, to introduce the pause, but you can experiment with that and you will see that you actually have the loading spinner, which is actually very good. For example, if I just go to my here to my backend code and I just comment this out and I try to submit, I will just have this loading state because it doesn't resolve. We have an error. So as you can see, it's very nice. Good. So we achieved what I planned for this session. So let's make the commits. Here I forgot to create here, even initialize a Git repository. That happens with me. But first, before we create it, let's create git ignore file, and we're gonna ignore node modules and ds store. Yeah, okay. Now we can git init bookworm API, and let's have a look at the status. Babel, good, looks good. So that's gonna be our initial commit with dummy auth route. And let's go to a React application. Here in status, we had a little bit more going on. Let's commit everything in one commit, and we call it make async request to server and render server validation errors. Async. Done. And I will push it to the GitHub a minute later. Also, I will create a new GitHub repository for Bookworm API, and you can find links below in the description. Okay, so that's it for this episode. If you like this episode, please hit the like button, subscribe to this channel, share it with your friends. If you want to support this channel, just go to my Patreon page, become the first patron. And yeah, thank you very much for your time and have a great day.